A 12-year-old boy walks into a boardroom full of billion-dollar egos and exposes a fraud no one else dared to see. They laughed at his scuffed laptop and quiet voice until he revealed a $4.6 million lie buried in polished slides. What started as a mother's desperate attempt to keep her job became a global reckoning that reshaped corporate ethics forever. But this isn't just a story about numbers. It's about courage, silence, and the price of truth. When a child refuses to look away, can the world keep pretending not to see? The boardroom smelled like tension and expensive cologne. Samantha Clark adjusted her blazer and pushed open the double-glass doors with more confidence than she felt. Inside, the room was already full. Men in dark suits, women with sharp eyes and sharper heels, everyone clutching notepads, phones, and lattes like weapons of control. And beside her, a boy, barely 12, stood gripping a scuffed laptop bag and blinking against the overhead light. "Is this a joke?" someone whispered, not softly enough. Samantha ignored it. So did the boy, and they walked to the empty seats reserved at the end of the long table. One was adult-sized. The other, clearly not intended for children, creaked slightly under the boy's frame as he sat. The CEO of Orion Holdings, Malcolm Reeves, stood at the head of the table, immaculate in navy wool. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Clark," he said, voice like polished stone, "this is a confidential audit review. We weren't informed you'd be bringing a guest." Samantha met his stare. "This is my son, Ben. He's here with me." "I see," Reeves said, but the way he said it made it clear he didn't. "Well, let's get started." The meeting opened with quarterly numbers, graphs, sales projections, divisional breakdowns, all spoken in clipped tones over glowing tablets. The executives nodded politely, murmuring agreement in turns. Ben said nothing. His eyes moved from person to person, then to the screens, then to the printed reports in front of his mother. He wasn't fidgeting. He was studying. Samantha had told him to sit quietly, observe, take no notes, say nothing. And for the first 45 minutes, he did just that. Until Reeves clicked to a slide labeled Southeast Revenue Pipeline, Q2 adjusted, and Ben's brow furrowed, only slightly, but Samantha saw it. He leaned close to her, whispered, "Mom, these numbers are wrong." She turned to him sharply. "Ben, they don't match the other set from earlier. Look." He pointed, not to the screen, but to a detail buried 3 slides back, near the margin. A tiny inconsistency. Samantha's eyes darted back and forth, and then she saw it too. Her breath hitched. "Ms. Clark?" Reeves asked. "Something to add?" She hesitated, and Ben, against everything she'd told him, stood up. "I'm sorry," he said, voice steady and clear, "but there's a mistake." Reeves blinked. "Excuse me?" "In slide 4, your adjusted revenue for the Southeast region is listed as $18.2 million, but that doesn't match the raw intake data from slide 2, which shows $13.6 million in client contracts. Even with optimistic projections, that difference doesn't reconcile." The room fell dead silent. Ben continued, "And when I cross-referenced the itemized invoice summaries, I found duplicate entries under 2 vendor codes that, according to the IRS, belong to the same holding company, which is registered in the Cayman Islands under a shell corp." Samantha slowly rose from her chair. Reeves narrowed his eyes. "What exactly are you implying, young man?" "I'm not implying," Ben said. "I'm pointing out. There's a $4.6 million discrepancy that doesn't track to any legitimate source. It looks like someone's inflating earnings to justify phantom revenue." Murmurs erupted around the table. One woman pulled up her own spreadsheet. Another exec leaned across the table, whispering urgently to a colleague. Samantha's heart pounded. Ben reached into his backpack, pulled out his laptop, and connected it to the room's display system without asking. The screen flashed, then opened on a heat map. "This is a visual overlay of reported regional earnings versus actual deposits," he said. The darker areas show overreported zones. Southeast is red, so is northwest, but that wasn't in today's report. Ms. Clark, Reeves said sharply, this is unacceptable. Samantha spoke for the first time. What's unacceptable, she said coldly, is that my son spotted in 40 minutes what your audit committee missed in 3 quarters. A man at the far end of the table stood. Sir, he said to Reeves, I'd like to move for an immediate independent review of all regional revenue claims from the past fiscal year, including an audit of offshore transactions. Reeves flushed. This is absurd. No, the man said. What's absurd is that a 12-year-old just handed us probable cause for financial fraud. Ben unplugged the laptop, sat down again, quietly, like nothing had happened. Samantha exhaled. The next day the board convened again, without Reeves. By the end of the week, the press had the story. By the end of the month, Ben's name was being whispered in corporate hallways, not as a joke, but as a warning. And Samantha, she didn't just keep her seat at the table, she was offered 3 more. All because the boy they laughed at stood up and told the truth. The headlines came fast. 12-year-old exposes multi-million-dollar accounting fraud at Orion Holdings. Audit committee ousted after child analyst uncovers financial shell game. The boy who outsmarted the boardroom. Samantha tried to shield Ben from the worst of it. The cameras outside their building, the messages from strangers, the reporters asking for exclusive interviews. But it was too late. The world had already found him. The story was too compelling. A boy with a beat-up laptop walking into a corporate war zone and pulling the rug out from under a billion-dollar operation. But what most people didn't know, what none of the articles reported, was that it hadn't been an accident. Ben had suspected something was wrong for months. It started when he helped Samantha organize receipts at home, the kind of tedious work no kid should enjoy, but Ben always had a fascination with patterns. He noticed something odd in the Orion quarterly packets she brought home. Figures that danced too neatly, projections that defied industry averages by just enough to seem plausible, but not enough to be honest. He asked her questions. She brushed them off at first, told him not to worry, but Ben worried anyway, quietly, methodically. He started pulling Orion's public reports, cross-checking with vendor databases, digging into registry filings at night while other kids played games. And what he found scared him. He hadn't told her everything before that meeting, because even at 12, he understood what risk looked like. If he was wrong, she'd lose her job. If he was right, people much more powerful than them would have reason to bury it. So when he stood up in that boardroom, it wasn't impulsive. It was a choice. And once the investigation began in earnest, everything came spilling out. Shell companies, fake vendors, a network of falsified contracts routed through 5 countries, and at the center of it all, Reeves. The CFO was indicted first, then 2 VPs. Reeves tried to disappear, but the SEC filed civil fraud charges before the month was out. Samantha testified in 3 hearings. Ben was interviewed behind closed doors by a federal oversight team. He answered every question, brought printouts, annotated reports, and never once asked for credit. I just wanted the numbers to be right, he said. Samantha watched all of it with pride she couldn't explain, the kind that made her feel both older and younger at once. The world had changed around her, but Ben remained exactly who he'd always been, quiet, precise, relentlessly fair. After Orion's stock tanked, the remaining board members launched a reform task force. One of them called Samantha personally. We'd like to bring you back, the woman said, in a leadership role this time, and your son, whatever resources he wants, within reason. Samantha didn't answer right away. She walked into the living room, where Ben was sitting cross-legged on the couch with his laptop balanced on his knees. "They want us back," she said. Ben looked up. "Will I still be allowed to call out liars?" She laughed. "Not only allowed, encouraged." He nodded once. Then yeah. Okay. She sat beside him. You're not scared? Ben shrugged. Not of numbers. And she realized then that no matter how high the stakes climbed, as long as her son had a keyboard and the truth, he'd never need permission to be extraordinary. 3 months passed. The storm had quieted, but the ripples hadn't. Reeves was still awaiting trial, but the headlines had moved on. The media always did. Still, within certain circles, the kinds where board members whispered in corridors and executives forwarded each other's stories at midnight, Ben Clark's name lingered like a ghost in the machine. Inside Orion's newly restructured offices, Samantha walked through halls that once made her feel invisible. Now people stood when she entered a room, not out of fear, out of something closer to reverence. She hadn't asked for it. She didn't wear it like armor, but she carried it anyway, the way only someone who'd once been dismissed could. Ben had been given his own corner desk in her new department, not for show, but because no one could argue with his insight. Technically, he wasn't an employee. Legally, he couldn't be. But Samantha made sure the analysts listened when he spoke, and they did. One morning, she found him with 3 monitors open, toggling between reports. His shoelaces were untied. His cereal was half-eaten on a napkin next to the keyboard. "You know it's Saturday, right?" she asked, leaning against the doorframe. Uh-huh, Ben mumbled, typing. She smiled. "You planning to go outside today? Maybe talk to someone who's not wrapped in a spreadsheet?" He paused, looked up. "Maybe after I finish flagging anomalies in Q4 vendor consolidation." She walked over, peered at his screen. "Still digging?" "Yeah. I don't think Reeves was working alone." Samantha straightened. "You're serious?" Ben turned the screen toward her. "These payouts to Greenpoint Systems? They're masked as logistics services, but I ran the vendor ID. It resolves to a P.O. box leased by a company called Adlar Tech. Guess who sits on their advisory board?" She didn't answer. He clicked. A profile appeared. A man in his late 50s. Gold watch, white hair, cold eyes. "Douglas Finch," Ben said, "former compliance director, retired, right before the audit started." Samantha exhaled. "This goes deeper." Ben nodded. She looked at her son, this boy who had once walked into a room full of powerful men and dismantled a decade of fraud with nothing but facts and a steady voice. "You know what this means?" she said. "They'll come after us harder this time," he replied. "You're not afraid?" He shook his head. "Not of liars." She reached down, tied his shoelaces, and kissed the top of his head. "Then let's go tell the truth." The second wave didn't come with noise, it came with silence. Emails that went unanswered, phone calls that dropped midway through. Suddenly meetings were canceled without explanation. A quiet freeze spread through the upper floors of Orion like frost creeping along glass. Ben noticed it first. "Mom," he said one morning, looking up from his screen, "someone's trying to bury this." Samantha was already one step ahead. Her inbox had been flooded with unreviewed files the night before, padded reports, heavily redacted summaries, innocuous titles masking sensitive data. Someone had triggered an internal lock. The deeper she and Ben had dug into the Greenpoint Adlar connection, the more the system pushed back. Delays, firewall errors, insufficient clearance messages for files she'd accessed the week before. And then, on Tuesday, someone sent Ben an anonymous message through a secure upload link he'd buried deep inside Orion's vendor database. It simply read, "Watch your back, they're scrubbing Finch's trail." Attached were 8 PDF files and a spreadsheet. Ben printed everything, laid it out across their kitchen table, and stared at it for hours. Samantha watched him quietly, making tea and waiting. "Mom," he finally said, "I know where the money's going." He traced the transfers across 5 front companies, each one laundering funds through inflated contract pricing, then cycling it back into a firm called Dynex Holdings. The twist? Dynex had a minority stake in Orion's board member pension fund. "They're stealing from the top and padding their own exits," Ben said. "Finch was just the funnel." Samantha didn't ask how he'd found it. She only asked, "Can you prove it?" Ben nodded. The next morning she requested a private meeting with Orion's newly installed ethics chair. She didn't bring her department head. She didn't bring a lawyer. She brought her son. Ben walked into the room with a simple binder and a flash drive. No blazer, no polish, just facts. He laid out the fraud in 15 minutes. By the end, the ethics chair, a woman with 30 years in federal compliance, was white-faced and silent. "Do you know what this is?" she asked. Ben nodded. "It's systemic fraud, and it didn't end with Reeves." Within 48 hours, an emergency board session was convened. This time, no one laughed. No one questioned why a 12-year-old was speaking. They listened, and when Samantha and Ben walked out of that room, they knew what they had just done wasn't just uncover another scheme. They had exposed the culture, a machine built on silence, and shattered it with truth. The investigation that followed made national news, not in a headline-grabbing, splashy scandal kind of way, but in the quiet, steady pulse of exposés, subpoenas, and SEC bulletins that circulated through the veins of corporate America. What Ben and Samantha uncovered became a case study. Internal fraud, protected by layers of plausible deniability, wrapped in paper trails designed to mislead even trained auditors. But it hadn't fooled a 12-year-old who noticed what no one else did, that the numbers didn't feel right. Orion Holdings' leadership was gutted by year's end. 6 board members resigned. 3 faced formal charges. 2 Fortune 100 companies quietly withdrew merger offers, citing reputational instability. Investors were livid. Whistleblower protection teams were formed overnight in companies that had never had them. Ethics consultants saw a 400% spike in calls from panicked executives. And through it all, Samantha and Ben kept working. They didn't sign a book deal. They didn't go on television. They sat at their dining room table, reviewing ledgers and metadata side by side. One afternoon, as a new team at Orion prepared to roll out its first fully transparent financial report in years, the acting CEO requested a photo for the internal newsletter, something symbolic. They sent one. It wasn't a posed headshot. It was Ben, sitting cross-legged on the floor, laptop open, surrounded by printed spreadsheets and receipts, looking up at the camera mid-thought, unaware the photo had even been taken. The caption read, "We asked for accountability, we got brilliance." Samantha read the article once, folded it neatly, and tucked it into a drawer. They didn't need applause. They had truth. And they knew, somewhere out there, in another company's boardroom, someone else had just looked up from a spreadsheet and started asking questions. The fall semester began without ceremony. Ben was still technically in middle school, but there was no class schedule taped to the fridge, no back-to-school shopping trip, no hollow promise of a normal year. That life, locker combinations, team projects, pizza Fridays, had slipped quietly out of reach somewhere in between forensic spreadsheets and subpoenas. But Ben didn't seem to mind. He woke up early, ate a quiet breakfast while scrolling through SEC disclosures, and logged onto a remote learning platform that his mother had customized herself, filled with modules on corporate governance, behavioral economics, and data security protocols. On paper, he was just another kid doing independent study. In practice, he was the only 12-year-old currently advising a major ethics task force. Samantha tried to hold on to the familiar. She still packed him lunch. She still reminded him to drink water, stretch his legs, and wear socks with shoes. But the boy who once asked for Legos now requested API access to public watchdog portals. His world had shifted, and so had hers. Still, every once in a while, he reminded her that he was still a kid, like the time she found him asleep at his desk, face down on an audit trail printout, a chocolate milk bottle tucked under his arm, like a thermos in a foxhole, or the day he rewrote a vendor reconciliation tool in Python and named it Fraudosaurus. It made her smile. Because under the brilliance, the circuits, the syntax, the spreadsheets, there was still a boy who had just wanted his mom to keep her job, a boy who loved numbers not for power, but for their honesty, their clarity. But as the attention grew, so did the pressure. After the second investigation at Orion broke wide open, Samantha received a call from a senator's office, not a staffer, the senator herself. "We'd like to consult with you," the voice said. "Both of you." Samantha blinked, gripping the phone tighter. "I'm sorry. Consult on what?" "On building a model, something replicable. We have departments that review oversight reports from a dozen federal agencies, and we're realizing we're still missing things. We want to know how your son saw what everyone else missed." Samantha turned to look at Ben, who was flipping through an annotated printout of the 2021 Sarbanes-Oxley whistleblower amendments. "I don't know if you understand what you're asking," she said. "He's 12. "I think we do," the voice replied. "And that's exactly why we're calling." 3 weeks later, they were flown to D.C. It wasn't glamorous. There were no red carpets or camera flashes, just beige walls, long tables, and nameplates printed in 12-point Times New Roman, but Samantha could tell the weight in the room had changed. Ben wasn't just a novelty anymore. He was a resource. They asked him simple questions first. How did you know to look at vendor duplication? Why did you cross-reference shell registries? Ben answered each with a quiet confidence, like someone explaining how to make a sandwich. "Fraud hides in patterns," he said. "Not just in what's there, but in what should be there but isn't, like silence in a song." One analyst leaned forward. "Did you study formal detection models?" Ben shook his head. "I studied what people do when they think no one's watching. Then I looked for the numbers that match their habits." Samantha watched their faces shift. Skepticism replaced by something close to awe. They weren't listening to a kid. They were listening to someone who saw the world differently, and they wanted that vision for themselves. After the meeting, one of the staffers handed Samantha a folder. In-keyed were outlines for a new task force. Youth engagement in corporate ethics, a pilot program. They wanted Ben involved. She tucked it under her arm. She hadn't said yes. Not yet. Because she wasn't sure if Ben wanted the world to keep asking for pieces of him. That night in the hotel, they sat on opposite beds, their laptops open, soft glow lighting the room in twin halos. "Mom," Ben said, "do you think I'm weird?" She looked over at him, startled. "No," she said. "I think you're rare, and rare makes people uncomfortable sometimes." He nodded. I didn't mean to become all this." "I know. They just didn't listen, so I made them." Samantha smiled, eyes stinging a little. "And now that they're listening?" Ben paused, closed his laptop. "I want to help more people who don't know how to speak yet." That was when she knew. It wasn't about the fraud. It never had been. It was about truth and voice. And all the people like him who noticed everything but had been told to stay quiet. Samantha opened the folder. "Then let's teach them how." They called it the Shadow Ledger, an internal name used only in fragments across anonymized emails, hard-coded in backups that were never meant to see daylight. Buried so deeply in Orion's legacy servers that even seasoned forensic accountants missed it. But Ben didn't. It was a rainy Friday afternoon and the office had cleared out early. Samantha was on a call with a compliance team from Toronto when Ben wandered into the lab, sock-footed, a spoon in his mouth and a half-eaten cup of peanut butter in his hand. She barely noticed him slip past the double doors into the archive vault. A few minutes later, he reappeared, peanut butter gone, laptop open, eyes locked on a single line of code. "Mom," he said. She held up a finger, still listening to someone explain restitution clauses. "Mom," he repeated, firmer now, "you need to see this." She ended the call. Ben dropped the laptop onto the conference table and spun it toward her. On the screen was a directory tree, folders with random numeric labels, meaningless at first glance, but each folder contained one encrypted file. Same size, same timestamp, same embedded checksum. "What am I looking at?" she asked. Ben didn't answer. He pulled up a virtual machine, bypassed the embedded encryption, using a brute force loop he'd been refining in his spare time, and opened the first file. It was a spreadsheet. Samantha leaned in, and her blood went cold. It wasn't just internal data, it was payouts, quiet ones, to names she recognized and names she didn't, former executives, consultants, even a few vendors she thought had disappeared quietly years ago. Some were marked severance, others insurance. A few had no label at all, just dates and dollar signs routed through accounts that didn't match Orion's ledger. "This isn't in any of the audit records," she said. "Nope," Ben replied. "It lives in a secure clone of the old accounting framework. The folder was mirrored before they transitioned to the new cloud stack, hidden in a partition that was intentionally mislabeled as corrupted, which means someone knew the fraud wouldn't stop with Reeves, so they built a separate system to keep it hidden, a vault inside a vault." Samantha sat back, heart thudding. "This is bigger than we thought." Ben nodded. The fraud wasn't just tolerated, it was institutionalized. They worked through the night. Samantha reviewed each file, cross-referencing vendor IDs and account numbers. Ben traced IP logs, matching file access to badge entries. Every link in the chain told the same story. This wasn't one man's greed, it was a culture. A long, slow rot signed off by people who'd once sat beside her in that very boardroom. By morning, they had a map, a timeline, and a list of names. Ben pushed his chair back, rubbed his eyes, and looked up at his mother. "They're going to come after us, aren't they?" Samantha didn't sugarcoat it. "Yes." "Good," he said. "Then we know we're over the target." She smiled, not because she wasn't scared, but because her son had never been braver. They compiled everything into a secure drive. Samantha contacted Orion's legal counsel and invoked the full weight of her whistleblower protections. Then, without blinking, she handed over the shadow ledger. It detonated like a quiet bomb. No press release, no internal memo, just a sudden flurry of keycard revocations, quiet retirements, and 6 executives disappearing from the website's leadership page within 48 hours. The company survived. Barely. It rebranded 6 months later, abandoning the Orion name altogether, but everyone in the industry knew. And more importantly, everyone knew who had exposed it. Ben Clark, 12 years old, glasses too big for his face, quiet voice, careful eyes. The boy who dismantled a billion-dollar fraud ring with nothing but logic, peanut butter, and relentless truth. And Samantha Clark, the woman who refused to tell him to sit down when he stood up in a room full of liars. 1 year later, they sat in a quiet university auditorium where Ben was invited to give a talk not on coding or finance, but on integrity. The audience, professors, students, CEOs in casual jackets pretending not to be intimidated, sat in total silence as he spoke. "Fraud doesn't always look like crime," Ben said. "Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like doing your job and not asking questions. But silence lets rot grow roots, and roots grow into systems." He paused. "Everything we fixed at Orion started with one mistake on one slide." Another pause. And someone in the room not being afraid to say it out loud. When he finished, the applause didn't come in a roar. It came in a wave. Slow, building, unstoppable. Afterward, a young girl no older than 9 approached him in the aisle with a notebook clutched to her chest. "I want to be like you," she said. Ben knelt, smiled, and said, "Be better." And Samantha, watching from the back, realized something. They hadn't just uncovered a billion-dollar fraud, they'd built something stronger in its place. A blueprint for courage. The winter after the shadow ledger was exposed, Samantha noticed something new about her son, not in his intelligence, which had always been there like a steady hum under his skin, but in his stillness. He wasn't restless anymore. The part of him that used to fidget, tap his pencil, or wander off mid-thought now sat rooted. There was weight to him, gravity. He had become a person people looked toward, and he was only 13. That December, they were invited to speak at the International Ethics in Tech and Finance Conference in Berlin. Samantha was reluctant at first. Ben still hated crowds, still needed quiet after conversations, still recoiled when strangers treated him like a spectacle. But when she asked if he wanted to go, he simply nodded and said, "As long as they're listening." They were. The auditorium held nearly 600 people, executives, policy advisors, security officers, journalists, ethicists. Many had flown in specifically to hear the boy who brought down one of the largest private sector fraud rings in recent memory. Samantha spoke first. She kept it simple. Her story was their story. Corporate ladder, ignored emails, meaningless titles, glass ceilings. She told them about the boardroom, about the silence when Ben stood up, about the looks, the laughter, the disbelief. Then she said, they laughed because they believed they were safe. And they believed they were safe because people like me were always supposed to nod along, and people like Ben were never supposed to be in the room. She paused. But he was. Then she stepped back. Ben took the stage in jeans, a wrinkled button-up, and a badge clipped to a lanyard that dragged awkwardly down to his waist. He looked too young for the lights, too small for the podium, until he started talking. "People say I found a billion-dollar fraud," he began. "But I didn't find anything that wasn't already there. I just paid attention to what made me uncomfortable." He clicked the remote, showing a slide of two almost identical invoices. "I looked at this," he said, "and I felt a knot in my stomach, because I knew it wasn't a mistake. It was a choice." He showed more slides, false vendors, duplicate payments, nested holding companies. But the tech execs in the room weren't surprised. They had all seen this before, maybe even benefited from it. What they hadn't seen was what came next. Ben clicked again. This time the screen showed a single sentence typed in big black letters. The first time they lied, it was small enough to ignore. "That's how it starts," he said. "You look the other way once, and then you keep looking away. And eventually you forget what you were supposed to be looking for in the first place." He stepped away from the podium. "My mom didn't teach me to fight people. She taught me to respect the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it means standing in a room where everyone thinks you're wrong." Silence, and then applause, longer than he wanted. He sat down next to Samantha afterward, slumping into his chair. "Did I do okay?" he whispered. She wrapped an arm around his shoulders. "You made them see." That night, back in their hotel room, Ben pulled out a folder he'd been carrying in his backpack. Inside were 8 letters, handwritten, folded, some creased and smudged. They were from other kids who had seen the viral videos, read the news, heard about him from teachers. They didn't want advice. They wanted permission. "I found a payment in our student fund that doesn't make sense. My dad told me not to ask about his company's second office. My principal says I ask too many questions. How do I speak when everyone's louder than me?" Ben had written back to all of them. Simple things. "Keep asking. Keep watching. You're not too loud. They're just used to silence." He slid the last one back into the folder and said, "We should make something." Samantha looked over. "What kind of something?" "A way for people to send tips, but anonymously, and a way to verify them, not just a form, a system." She raised her eyebrows. "Like a whistleblower tool?" Ben nodded. "But better. One that learns how to spot patterns before humans do and protects the people who see them." She leaned forward. "Like you?" He gave a small smile. Yeah. And so they built it. A year later, that system, codenamed Signal Point, was adopted by 2 regulatory bodies and 5 Fortune 500 compliance divisions. Designed by a teenager, refined by his mother, it became the backbone of a quiet revolution, one that didn't wait for fraud to grow, but found it in its infancy, buried in spreadsheets and false receipts, and the subtle discomfort of a single number that didn't belong. They didn't ask for credit. They asked for honesty, and that made them dangerous in all the right ways. Ben's name became legend in the same boardrooms that once laughed when he walked in. Only now, when those doors opened, no one asked who he was. They knew. And more importantly, they knew they couldn't lie, not if he was watching. They moved again, quietly this time, without boxes or headlines or goodbyes, just a small apartment in a quieter city, far from the noise and cameras. Ben had asked for space, not just physical space, but cognitive space, room to think, to build, to step back from being the kid who caught the fraud. He didn't want to be a symbol anymore. He wanted to be a person. And Samantha understood, better than anyone. Their new home was modest. 2 bedrooms, big windows, books stacked on every flat surface. A whiteboard took up most of one wall, covered in half-finished logic trees and post-it notes with reminders like, "Check out the path loop," and "Don't forget to eat." Ben still worked, every day. But differently now. No more reacting to scandal. No more courtrooms or summits. Now it was quiet, focused. He was designing tools, smarter ones, tools that couldn't just detect patterns in numbers, but in behavior. He wanted to build something that could catch corruption before it needed a whistleblower. One morning, Samantha walked into the living room and found him staring at a single line of code, the same line he'd been staring at for over an hour. "You okay?" she asked. Ben didn't look away. Almost. Almost what? He tapped the screen. "This decision tree. It's the first one that doesn't end in a binary conclusion." She stepped closer, looked at the screen. The branches of the logic model extended in all directions. Some circled back, others faded, some duplicated. "Isn't that bad logic?" she asked gently. Ben shook his head. "No, it's human logic." She waited. "When people lie," he said, "they don't do it all at once. They don't type false into a cell. They hedge. They delay. They tell a softer version of the truth over and over until it becomes something else. And this tracks that? It learns to." She sat down on the couch, folding one leg under her. "You really think it'll work?" "I think it already does." That afternoon, he ran the first real test. Fed the system 20 anonymized case files from public record. In 18 of them, the tool correctly identified the exact moment, the line, the phrase, the transaction, where dishonesty took root, not the cover-up, not the scandal, the first lie. Samantha watched the results unfold in real time, watched her son, the boy who used to ask why numbers sometimes lied, build a tool to listen to them better than any adult ever had. "Is it strange," she said, "to know you've already done more by 13 than most people do in a lifetime?" Ben didn't answer. He was already fixing the 2 misidentified files. The calls came again, this time from institutions, not companies. 2 universities offered honorary positions. One invited him to co-author a paper on behavioral ethics. A law firm proposed a partnership. A nonprofit asked him to help build financial literacy programs for kids who, like him, thought faster than the systems around them and were punished for it. He turned most of them down. "Too loud," he said. "Too many grown-ups trying to look smart." But one request stopped him. It was from a small school district in Montana. Their message was simple. "We've got 4 kids here who don't talk much. Teachers say they daydream, fidget, stare at the corners, but I watched your testimony, and I think maybe they're just listening differently. Would you talk to them?" Ben read the message 5 times, then nodded. They flew out 2 weeks later. No press, no entourage. Just Samantha and Ben and a rental car that smelled like pine and gasoline. The school was small, one hallway, fluorescent lights. Bulletin boards covered in glitter glue reminders about fire drills and spelling bees. The 4 students waited in a classroom off the library. Ages ranged from 8 to 11. One bounced his leg nervously. Another tapped her fingers on the table like a Morse code nobody else understood. Ben sat with them, not across from them, beside them. He didn't start with a speech. He started with a question. "What's something you noticed this week that nobody else did?" At first, silence. Then the youngest whispered, "The custodian skips the second floor even when he says he cleans it." Another said, "The lunch menu doesn't match what we get." Another, "They say we get 10 minutes of recess, it's only 7. Ben smiled. "You're not wrong. You're watching." They looked at him, really looked. And for the first time, they didn't see a legend. They saw themselves. Afterward, as they walked back to the car, Samantha turned to him. "You think they'll be okay?" Ben nodded. "If someone keeps listening to them, yeah." And then he looked at her. "You always listened." She took his hand. "Always will." Years later, long after the headlines faded, long after the systems he built became quiet guardians behind the scenes of governments and boardrooms and institutions that would never admit they needed a 13-year-old to fix their foundations, long after all that, people still asked, how did it start? And the answer was always the same, with a boy in a boardroom, with a mother who wouldn't sit down, and with a truth too precise to ignore. ChatGPT said, "They moved again quietly this time, without boxes or headlines or goodbyes. Just a small apartment in a quieter city, far from the noise and cameras. Ben had asked for space, not just physical space, but cognitive space room, to think, to build, to step back from being the kid who caught the fraud. He didn't want to be a symbol anymore. He wanted to be a person. And Samantha understood better than anyone. Their new home was modest. 2 bedrooms, big windows, books stacked on every flat surface. A whiteboard took up most of one wall covered in half-finished logic trees and post-it notes with reminders like, "Check out the path, loop," and "Don't forget to eat." Ben still worked every day, but differently now. No more reacting to scandal, no more courtrooms or summits. Now it was quiet focused. He was designing tools, smarter ones, tools that couldn't just detect patterns in numbers, but in behavior. He wanted to build something that could catch corruption before it needed a whistleblower. One morning, Samantha walked into the living room and found him staring at a single line of code. The same line he'd been staring at for over an hour. "You okay?" she asked. Ben didn't look away. Almost what?" He tapped the screen. "This decision tree. It's the first one that doesn't end in a binary conclusion." She stepped closer, looked at the screen. The branches of the logic model extended in all directions. Some circled back, others faded, some duplicated. "Isn't that bad logic?" she asked gently. Ben shook his head. "No, it's human logic." She waited. "When people lie," he said, "they don't do it all at once. They don't type false into a cell. They hedge, they delay. They tell a softer version of the truth over and over until it becomes something else. And this tracks that. It learns to." She sat down on the couch, folding one leg under her. "You really think it'll work?" "I think it already does." That afternoon, he ran the first real test, fed the system, 20 anonymized case files from public record. In 18 of them, the tool correctly identified the exact moment the line, the phrase, the transaction where dishonesty took root. Not the cover-up, not the scandal. The first lie. Samantha watched the results unfold in real time, watched her son, the boy who used to ask why numbers sometimes lied, build a tool to listen to them better than any adult ever had. "Is it strange," she said, "to know you've already done more by 13 than most people do in a lifetime?" Ben didn't answer. He was already fixing the two misidentified files. The calls came again this time from institutions, not companies. Two universities offered honorary positions. One invited him to co-author a paper on behavioral ethics. A law firm proposed a partnership. A nonprofit asked him to help build financial literacy programs for kids who, like him, thought faster than the systems around them and were punished for it. He turned most of them down. Too loud, he said, too many grown-ups trying to look smart. But one request stopped him. It was from a small school district in Montana. Their message was simple. We've got 4 kids here who don't talk much. Teachers say they daydream, fidget, stare at the corners. But I watched your testimony, and I think maybe they're just listening differently. Would you talk to them? Ben read the message 5 times, then nodded. They flew out 2 weeks later. No press, no entourage. Just Samantha and Ben and a rental car that smelled like pine and gasoline. The school was small. One hallway, fluorescent lights, bulletin boards covered in glitter glue reminders about fire drills and spelling bees. The 4 students waited in a classroom off the library. Ages ranged from 8 to 11. One bounced his leg nervously. Another tapped her fingers on the table like a Morse code. Nobody else understood. Ben sat with them, not across from them, beside them. He didn't start with a speech. He started with a question. What's something you noticed this week that nobody else did? At first, silence. Then the youngest whispered, "The custodian skips the second floor even when he says he cleans it." Another said, "The lunch menu doesn't match what we get." Another, "They say we get 10 minutes of recess." "It's only 7. Ben smiled. "You're not wrong. You're watching." They looked at him, really looked. And for the first time they didn't see a legend, they saw themselves. Afterward, as they walked back to the car, Samantha turned to him. "You think they'll be okay?" Ben nodded. "If someone keeps listening to them." "Yeah." And then he looked at her. "You always listened." She took his hand. "Always will." Years later, long after the headlines faded, long after the systems he built became quiet guardians behind the scenes of governments and boardrooms and institutions that would never admit they needed a 13-year-old to fix their foundations, long after all that, people still asked, how did it start? And the answer was always the same. With a boy in a boardroom, with a mother who wouldn't sit down, and with a truth too precise to ignore. They never celebrated with champagne or parties. There was no confetti, no commemorative plaques, no breaking news, banners scrolling across the bottom of a screen when the last of the names was removed from the final internal report. No arrests, this time. No dramatic courtroom ending, just a line in a quarterly briefing that read, "Restructuring Complete Compliance Review Closed." And yet Samantha and Ben both knew what it meant. The last thread of the shadow ledger had been traced, cut, and brought into the light quietly, thoroughly, permanently. They had done what entire teams of investigators failed to do, not because they had more resources, but because they never stopped paying attention. The system Ben built kept evolving. He didn't name this one. It wasn't a singular program like Signal Point or an elegant concept like the empathy modeling he once toyed with. This was something else, something living, a learning net that crawled financial terrain in real time, scanning behavioral data, change patterns, memory of discrepancies and context variables. Samantha had watched him work long past midnight some nights. Eyes bloodshot, posture curled like a comma, but always focused. Always hunting, not for people, not to punish, but for signals, a wrong number, a too clean margin, a ghost vendor blinking like a warning light in the back of his mind. She worried sometimes that he carried too much, that the weight of being the one who saw things before anyone else ever noticed might fold him in on himself. But Ben seemed to carry it differently than before. He wasn't angry, he wasn't resentful, he was resolved, and that was more powerful than anything he'd ever been when they spoke now. It was less about the past and more about what was next, not how to survive, but how to teach others to see not just what's wrong, but how it starts, how it slips in through habit and protocol and the comfort of things looking right. When he was invited to a closed-door session with financial regulators in New York, Ben wore his school sweatshirt and mismatched socks. He didn't try to impress anyone, didn't pitch or posture or rehearse. He walked to the head of the table with a battered laptop and said, "I'm not here to scare you. I'm here because someone has to explain what fraud looks like before it's fraud." And then he did not with charts or jargon, but with a story about a misplaced zero, a duplicate address, an overlooked expense that didn't feel wrong at first until it became policy. And once it became policy, it became protected. And once protected, it became invisible. They asked him to stay on as a technical advisor. He declined politely, but offered to build them a better alert system free of charge. Samantha watched their faces when he said it. Not just shock, but shame. These were the people who were supposed to know better. And here was a teenager with peanut butter on his cuff, offering them the fix they couldn't build for themselves. She didn't gloat. She just nodded when they accepted. Back home, their lives were simple, a little strange, quiet but full. They didn't chase anything anymore, not recognition, not approval, not even resolution. Ben's systems were being used quietly in 17 countries across more than 36 corporate compliance frameworks. He never publicized it, never branded them. He just named each deployment after a type of bird sparrow kestrel linnet. As if he knew these systems weren't soldiers, they were watchers, perched quietly waiting ready to sing the moment something felt off. One evening, as rain tapped against the windows and the lights flickered slightly from a storm in the distance, Ben sat on the floor surrounded by printouts and snack wrappers cross-referencing flagged anomalies from a shipping firm that had asked for a consult. He looked up suddenly and asked, "Do you think people will ever get tired of pretending not to see?" And Samantha replied without looking from her screen, "Maybe, but not before it costs them something." And Ben nodded, then let out a long breath and said, "Maybe I'll build a system that teaches people how to look before that happens." And she laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was exactly what he'd say. Years passed slowly, and then all at once Ben never stopped building. But he did start teaching, not in classrooms, not in universities, but in messages, in open-source forums, and encrypted group threads, where quiet voices asked, "How do I know if what I found is real?" And Ben would reply with questions, not answers, guiding, never pushing, helping them think like he did, like his mother had taught him to, like no one had taught her. The world never gave them trophies, never carved their names into plaques, but in places that mattered, in rooms where money moved and silence once ruled. People hesitated now before approving a line they didn't understand, because somewhere out there a system might be watching, not to punish but to ask a question. One question that sounded so much like Ben, it echoed even when he wasn't in the room. "Are you sure this is true?" And for the first time in a long time, people started answering honestly because someone finally showed them how. It was never about the headlines, not for Samantha, not for Ben. The noise came and went, like storms crashing against windows. But what stayed, what mattered, were the quiet changes, the ones that didn't announce themselves, but unfolded slowly, like light, reaching the back of a long, dark room after everything with Orion. After the ledgers, the testimonies, the reforms, after the toolkits and the task forces and the whispers in boardrooms, Ben did something nobody expected. He logged off. He didn't disappear. He just stepped back from the spotlight, from the nonstop calls and conference invitations and ethics panels that wanted to use his name as a banner for their change. He told his mother one day over breakfast, "I think I just want to build things that help without needing to explain them anymore." And she understood immediately, because she'd been watching him carry too many rooms for too long. And when someone that young carries power, they were never supposed to have it, burns them slowly from the inside out. So she helped him go quiet again, not in retreat, but in purpose. They moved to a small town where nobody cared what Ben had done, where the neighbors waved but didn't ask, and the grocery clerk called him Bud without blinking when he didn't make eye contact. Their house was modest white walls, wooden floors, sun that pooled through big windows in the afternoon. Ben turned the attic into a lab, the walls lined with insulation and marker-smeared diagrams and prototype motherboards scattered like puzzle pieces waiting to be solved. Samantha gave him space, didn't ask too many questions, not because she wasn't curious, but because she trusted him to share when he was ready. She still worked part-time now with a nonprofit that helped teach financial literacy to kids who had been told their minds didn't work the right way, and every now and then she'd see one of them build something beautiful and realize quietly it was because someone had listened. Ben started writing again, not reports or logs, but stories, sometimes poems, sometimes just thoughts about trust, about the silence between two people, when something honest passes between them. He said, writing helped him think clearer than code, and Samantha believed him. Even when the words seemed too heavy for someone so young. One of the stories was about a fox who guarded a city not by biting or barking, but by asking questions, and making the city look at itself every morning. It would walk the perimeter and whisper what changed overnight, and the city would have to answer. He submitted it to a small journal anonymously. It was published a month later, and when Samantha found the page marked with a yellow tab and saw the fox's words, she didn't say anything. She just smiled and folded the paper carefully, like something sacred. The programs he had built continued to work quietly. They evolved on their own in systems around the world, flagging patterns, not errors, asking questions, not issuing punishments. They had become something better than watchdogs. They had become conscience, a built-in voice that said gently, "Pause, are you sure?" And it turned out sometimes that voice was all it took to stop the lie before it was born. People still reached out from time to time. They'd heard about him from a decade-old article or a government white paper, or a lecture someone else gave citing him as the reason they changed their systems. And the messages all said the same thing. "I know you're probably busy, or I doubt you'll see this, but you helped me see something I couldn't name until now." And every now and then, Ben would write back a single line. "Keep listening, or you're not wrong," or "Truth starts small like all good things," and then close his laptop and go back to whatever he'd been building. Samantha watched him grow, not just older, but deeper, not just smarter, but quieter. He still had that sharpness, the mind, that could slice through any knot of data, but he used it differently now. Softer, not for battle, but for building. She thought often about that first day in the boardroom, the way the room had laughed before it listened, the way her son had stood not to prove anything, but because the truth inside him had nowhere else to go, and she was still proud. But now that pride felt different, heavier, yes, but also warmer, like standing near a fire you never expected to be invited to. And one day, when she found him in the attic staring out the window at nothing in particular, she asked what he was thinking, and he said, "Not much, just wondering how many people tell the truth before they know it matters." And she didn't have an answer, but she sat beside him and let the question hang there unbroken, because sometimes the best things they ever did weren't answers at all. They were the courage to ask something nobody else wanted to hear, and the patience to listen for what came next in the silence. The winter stretched long and quiet, the way certain seasons do when time seems to pull taut between snowfalls, and everything slows to the rhythm of breath against frosted glass. Ben had taken to walking at dusk through the trails behind their house, bundled in an oversized coat with earbuds in and a notebook in his pocket. Not because he needed to write, but because sometimes the act of carrying it reminded him that ideas could arrive at any time. The quiet wasn't empty for him. It was fuel space where thoughts could stretch out without interruption and organize themselves into something useful, something beautiful. Samantha watched from the window each evening as his figure disappeared into the trees. A solitary silhouette moving calmly along paths no one else seemed to follow. She wasn't worried anymore, not the way she had been during the chaos, when he was thrust into a world of grown-up corruption and crisis and consequence. Now she saw something steadier in him, a kind of peace earned, not inherited. He had done what no one asked of him, and more than what anyone had expected, and now he had built a life not just for others, but for himself, one step at a time. Inside the house, things were simple. No glowing screens, no breaking headlines, just the steady hum of quiet routines. Tea steeping on the stove, books open on the table paper, clipped together and marked with gentle scribbles. Ben's projects had shifted from exposing lies to preventing them. His newest prototype wasn't an audit tool or a whistleblower platform. It was something more abstract, a pattern simulator that could model how small decisions multiplied across systems, how one minor act of dishonesty in a procurement file could ripple through a company's culture like dye in water. What if people could see their choices like that, he wondered, not as isolated actions, but as seeds. The model used a grid of colored lights, each blinking in response to simulated inputs. If a user chose to underreport revenue, in one sector, another sector dimmed subtly. Morale metrics declined, trust indices lagged. 2 simulated employees resigned. 3 hypothetical clients paused communication. None of it dramatic, but all of it cumulative. And when Samantha tried it, she stared at the screen afterward, for a long time quiet, her hand resting on the mouse, and said softly, "People need to see this because it didn't shame, it didn't punish, it simply revealed the truth in motion," which in the end was what Ben always cared about. Not blame, not justice, just clarity. By spring, they had quietly deployed a test version of the simulator in a university program for executive leadership. No fanfare, no names attached. Just a module inside a week-long ethics course. On the second day of the pilot, an instructor emailed Samantha to say one of the CEOs in the class cried during the session, not because the simulator accused him of anything, but because it made him realize how many decisions he'd made with blinders, on how many shortcuts he'd taken because the system allowed it, because no one ever paused to ask where it led, until now. Ben read the message without expression and simply said, "Then it's working," and moved on to version 2. And Samantha marveled not at his intellect. She had long ago stopped being surprised by that, but at his consistency, his unwavering loyalty to the idea that truth deserved a chance to be seen, not forced, not shouted, simply revealed for what it was and trusted to do the rest on its own. People often mistook his silence for detachment, but it was the opposite. He cared so deeply it sometimes overwhelmed him, and so he poured that care into systems, into logic, into quiet instruments that could outlive any conversation. When the letter came in June, it was hand-signed from an International Council on Corporate Governance, inviting Ben to consult on a global framework for early fraud detection. Samantha showed it to him over dinner, expecting at least a flicker of surprise or pride. Instead, he nodded once and said, "Only, we should also include a module for ethical recovery. Most systems stop at exposure, but they don't show people how to rebuild." And Samantha paused, fork halfway to her mouth, and realized again how different he was from the world that once laughed when she brought him into the boardroom. That world had been loud, so loud back then, full of scoffs and sidelong glances and questions, not asked directly, but whispered behind raised coffee cups and closed doors. And yet, in all the noise, it had been Ben's quiet certainty that changed everything. And now, years later, his work didn't need his name on the cover because the systems spoke for themselves. The tools whispered where others shouted, the lessons echoed in boardrooms and classrooms and small rural schools where kids learned to pause before signing their name to a ledger they didn't understand. And at night, when the house was still and the windows were dark and the wind pressed against the siding, Samantha would walk past his door, see the soft blue glow of a monitor, and feel no worry, only gratitude that her son had taken all the noise the world threw at him and turned it into something enduring, something that didn't just catch lies but taught people how to stop telling them before they started, something that lasted longer than headlines and louder than applause, a quiet legacy built from the silence everyone else tried to ignore. Summer arrived slowly, not with fireworks or heat waves, but with soft winds and long evenings and the kind of stillness that felt earned. Ben's walks got longer, sometimes hours. He took different trails, paths that curved through marshy woods and past old stone fences covered in moss. He rarely brought his phone, only a pencil and his notebook. Samantha stopped asking where he went or what he was thinking. She'd learned not to interrupt his silence because it wasn't absence, it was process. This was how he worked, not in sprints of visible productivity, but in waves of deep consideration that surfaced only when he was ready. Their house had grown quiet in new ways. No alerts from compliance teams, no inbox flooded with confidential files, no press inquiries. There were weeks when it almost felt like they'd dreamed the entire thing, like the boy who once stood up in a boardroom and dismantled a billion-dollar fraud had lived a different life entirely. But the truth lingered, even if it didn't announce itself anymore. It lived in the emails Ben still got from time to time, messages from anonymous interns or junior accountants or ethics officers who had seen something they couldn't ignore and didn't know what to do next. Some were one sentence. Others were long, detailed, shaky. All of them were some variation of the same question, how do I speak when I know no one wants to listen? And Ben, without fail, always answered. Not with instructions, not with checklists, but with clarity. He asked them the questions they were afraid to ask themselves. What would happen if you didn't say anything? Who benefits from your silence? Who pays the price for your comfort? He didn't tell them what to do. He reminded them what they already knew. Samantha once asked him if it was exhausting, being the one everyone expected to have the moral compass. Ben just shrugged and said, "It's not about being right. It's about not pretending you don't know what's wrong." She didn't press him after that, because she understood. He had never chased justice. He had never wanted attention. He just wanted people to look more closely. That summer, they launched a new version of the simulator. It had a different name now, Flux, not an acronym, just a word Ben liked. It felt honest, dynamic, alive. Flux wasn't flashy. It didn't generate long reports or colorful dashboards. It asked questions, a lot of them. It forced users to explain their reasoning. It pushed for transparency. It tracked the chain of logic behind each decision. And, most importantly, it simulated consequences, not just financial, but human. If you cut this budget, who loses their job? If you fudge this line item, who absorbs the fallout? If you misclassify this expense, what does that teach the next person who looks at this file? The beta testers were stunned. Some were defensive, others were quiet. A few cried. One emailed Samantha a week later and said, "I didn't realize how numb I'd become. Flux made me feel like I had a conscience again." Ben read the message and smiled faintly, but he didn't linger on it. The next morning, he was already outlining a new feature, one that would allow users to go back, to trace their own decisions over time, to see the arc of their ethical behavior like a thread. It would show them where they bent, where they broke, and where they held firm. Samantha watched him build it line by line. It reminded her of something he once said, "Truth starts small, like all good things." They rarely spoke of Orion anymore, not because it didn't matter, but because it didn't need to be revisited. The people who had tried to silence the truth were gone. Their legacies dissolved. The company itself had restructured, rebranded, and tried to rebuild. But the systems Ben designed had outlasted all of it, quietly, efficiently. They didn't scream when something went wrong, they whispered before it did. That was the real victory, not the press, not the trial, not the legacy. The fact that fewer people were being hurt, that fewer systems were being built on silence. One night, as the sky turned lavender and the fireflies lit the tree line behind the house, Ben and Samantha sat on the back steps with mugs of tea and a shared blanket. The air smelled like pine and warm soil. Ben leaned against her shoulder, not as a child, but simply as someone tired in a way only honesty can tire you. He was still young, but older than he had any right to be. She ran her fingers through his hair and asked softly, "Do you ever miss the noise?" Ben shook his head. "The noise never listened. The quiet does." She nodded, and for a long time they said nothing, just breathed, just watched the night settle over the world they'd helped change, not perfectly, not completely, but meaningfully, quietly, lastingly. The way truth always does when it's given room to speak. Autumn arrived with gold in the trees and a kind of hush that Samantha had always loved, the quiet shift in temperature that made the world feel slightly softer, slower, more thoughtful. It was the season she associated with transitions, with sharpened pencils and clean notebooks, with the smell of cold air caught in Ben's hoodie after he came back from one of his long walks. This year, there were no milestones, no anniversaries to mark the moment he'd changed everything, no interviews, no reminders. And yet, the impact of what he'd done still moved quietly through places they would never see. Quiet emails, policy shifts, code libraries bearing subtle fragments of his architecture, truth traveling through systems he no longer monitored but had built to carry on without him. Ben spent most mornings with his sleeves rolled up, curled over a terminal in the sunroom, surrounded by wires and half-finished diagrams. The latest build wasn't like the others. It wasn't for corporations or regulators. It wasn't even for adults. It was something different, something simpler and more radical in its simplicity. A learning environment for middle schoolers to identify ethical dilemmas in real-world scenarios, to track consequences, to develop language for discomfort. It asked questions instead of giving lessons. It offered choices, not corrections. It let kids explore not only what was allowed, but what was right. And it started, as all his best projects did, with a notebook filled with phrases like, "What does fairness feel like?" and "What if no one sees you, but you still choose to do the right thing?" Samantha helped test it. She played through a few modules on the couch while dinner simmered in the kitchen, frowning as she realized even she, with her years of experience and clarity, hesitated at some of the questions. One scenario involved a coworker taking credit for your work, not once, but 3 times in subtle ways. You could report them, you could ignore it, or you could confront them privately. But the question wasn't just what you chose, it was why. The software prompted her to reflect before confirming her response. When she picked confrontation, it asked, "Are you doing this to protect your boundaries or to punish them?" She set the laptop down and stared at it for a long time. Ben entered the room, grabbed a glass of water, and nodded at the screen. "Did it ask the thing?" She raised an eyebrow. "You programmed it to ask the thing?" He grinned. "Always. It's the part most people skip over, motivation." By November, the beta group had grown to include schools in 3 states. Teachers reported back that students who never raised their hands in class suddenly stayed late to talk about the choices they made in Ben's program. One girl wrote in a feedback box, "I didn't know other people felt weird when they knew something was wrong but couldn't explain it." Another student had tried to replicate the scenarios in real life, testing his teachers to see how they'd react. When he got caught, instead of punishing him, the teacher asked to speak with Ben. She said, "He's not being disruptive. He's testing what accountability feels like. I want to learn how to respond to that better." Ben didn't celebrate. He didn't even mention it to most people. He simply added the feedback to his data log, updated the scenario matrix, and built a new branch that modeled outcomes based on not just what a person does, but what they hope will happen. The hope layer, as he called it, wasn't about optimism. It was about understanding what someone wants the world to do in response to their action, and how often those hopes go unmet. It made the model smarter, more human, more honest. Samantha watched all of this unfold, and knew that no matter what titles people gave him, prodigy, whistleblower, truth architect, what her son had always been more than anything was a builder. He didn't destroy systems to watch them fall. He dismantled them to rebuild something stronger. He didn't just see cracks. He understood what needed to grow through them. She'd watched him in boardrooms and basements, in hearings and hotel lobbies, with the same calm intensity, the same refusal to be distracted by power or praise. His loyalty was to clarity, not control. And now, more than ever, that clarity was turning into something useful, something teachable. One night, while clouds crawled slowly across the moon and the wind pressed gently against the window panes, Samantha asked Ben if he missed the way things were back then, when everything was louder, faster, urgent. He thought about it for a long time, stirring his tea with a spoon that had long since cooled. "No," he said, "I miss knowing when I'm finished." "You don't feel that anymore?" He shook his head. "There's always another thing to build, another question to answer, another blind spot to light up." She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "That's what makes you dangerous to the right people, and useful to the rest," he said softly. In that moment, Samantha thought about all the people they'd never meet. The quiet analysts, the nervous interns, the students who would one day sit in rooms like the one Ben once stood in, who would see something wrong, feel that knot in their chest, and think about a soft-spoken boy who taught them that being right isn't about being loud. It's about refusing to look away. And maybe, just maybe, they'd speak. Winter came heavy and early that year, blanketing the little town in snow before the leaves had even finished falling. The streets went quiet except for the crunch of boots and the slow hum of snowplows in the distance. Inside their home, Ben and Samantha adjusted their routines to match the season. The house always smelled like cinnamon or chamomile, with something baking in the oven more often than not, and a dozen half-written notebooks left open like breadcrumbs across every flat surface. The outside world slowed, but their minds did not. Ben had started a new project. It didn't have a name yet, and he didn't talk about it much, but Samantha knew it was different. Not because it was more complex, though it was, or more ambitious, though it certainly leaned that way, but because he carried it with him the way people carry questions that don't have answers yet. He moved through the house with a kind of quiet tension, pausing mid-thought to scribble on the fridge notepad or to stare at the snow outside as if it might reveal something he hadn't yet considered. She let him be. That had always been their rhythm. She never pressed for what came next. She just made sure there was space for it to arrive. One night she walked into the living room and found him sitting on the floor surrounded by stacks of printed email exchanges. All anonymized, all voluntarily submitted, dozens of messages from whistleblowers, truth-tellers, people who had come forward in their own jobs, their own towns, their own families, and been punished for it. Some were fired. Some were ostracized. Some had simply been ignored into silence. Ben had been collecting these accounts for months, ever since the launch of his education platform. He hadn't told anyone, not even her. He looked up and gestured for her to sit, and then he handed her one of the letters. A man from Ohio, middle manager, had raised a concern about duplicate vendor payouts and was called paranoid by his CFO. Lost his job, never got back into the industry, still checking back over those invoices long after the opportunity to fix anything had passed, still wondering if he should have just stayed quiet. Samantha read it slowly, then another, then another. "This isn't just data," she said quietly. Ben nodded. "It's a pattern." She looked at him. "You want to build something with it?" "I want to show what silence costs," he said. "Not in lawsuits, in people." He told her the idea then, fully for the first time. A visualization tool, not for fraud detection but for narrative analysis. A system that took in stories like these, anonymized them, and modeled the social, economic, and psychological impact of speaking up versus staying quiet. It wasn't about who was right. It was about what people risked, what they lost. what they carried afterward. It would track not just the truth, but the weight of it. Samantha felt her throat tighten. "And who's it for?" Ben looked back down at the paper in his hands. "For people who think it's not worth it," he said. "I want them to see that it is." They spent the next 4 months building it. It was the first time in a long time they collaborated directly on something, and the energy between them felt like it did in the early days, not frantic, but alive. Late nights turned into early mornings. Arguments turned into breakthroughs. Samantha handled the qualitative modeling, categorizing impact types, and building the taxonomy for risk clusters. Ben wrote the engine that learned from each entry and created visual feedback loops that showed users not just what someone experienced, but how long it stayed with them, how it echoed across decisions, how it changed them. When they finished, they called it Lantern, because it didn't expose. It illuminated. They opened it quietly as always. No launch video, no campaign. Just a URL posted in a few ethics forums and community boards. And it spread like light in the dark. Not instantly, not loudly, but inevitably. Teachers used it to show students the human side of accountability. Journalists used it to understand whistleblower behavior. Therapists used it with clients working through guilt for staying silent. Even corporations started using it in private leadership trainings to simulate the real cost of a culture where no one feels safe telling the truth. And with every news story submitted, Lantern grew brighter. But they didn't try to scale it, didn't monetize, didn't seek partnerships. "It's not a tool," Ben said one evening, as they sat side by side watching the newest entries populate across the soft-lit dashboard. "It's a witness." Samantha looked at him, the boy who had once stood in a room full of people who dismissed him and told the truth anyway. The boy who had grown into someone who didn't just value honesty, but protected it, nurtured it, shared it without needing to be thanked. "You were always a witness, M'Bosquipene," she said. "You just gave everyone else the courage to be one too." Ben smiled, but didn't reply. He didn't need to. The numbers were already there. The names, the impact, the invisible weight made visible. 1,000 small moments of truth held in the light, finally seen.